The MV Wilhelm Gustloff is remembered as one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history.
The sinking of the German passenger ship during the final days of World War II led to the loss of over 9,000 lives, the majority of which were innocent civilians, including women and children. The disaster, which took place on January 30, 1945, remains a somber and tragic event that has often been overshadowed by other war-related shipwrecks, such as the Titanic or the Lusitania, but its sheer scale of loss is undeniable.
The MV Wilhelm Gustloff was originally built as a German passenger liner, launched in 1937.
It was designed as a luxury cruise ship for the Kraft der Freude, Strength Through Joy program, a Nazi initiative intended to provide affordable holidays for German workers. The ship was named after Wilhelm Gustloff, a prominent Nazi Party official who had been assassinated in 1936 by a Jewish student. The Wilhelm Gustloff served as a symbol of Nazi propaganda and was designed to exude a sense of national pride. At the time of its launch, the Wilhelm Gustloff was one of the largest and most luxurious ships in the world. It could accommodate over 1,800 passengers and crew, with a lavish interior that rivaled some of the most famous ocean liners of its time. The ship was equipped with luxurious amenities, including swimming pools, fine dining rooms, and even a concert hall. However, as the war progressed, the ship's purpose would drastically change. By early 1945, World War II was nearing its end, and the Third Reich was facing imminent defeat. The Soviet Red Army had advanced deep into Eastern Europe, and millions of Germans in East Prussia and other occupied territories were fleeing in anticipation of the Soviet invasion. This led to a mass evacuation effort, known as the Ostprussen Evakuierung, evacuation of East Prussia, in which civilians, soldiers, and war refugees sought to escape from the advancing Soviet forces.
The Wilhelm Gustloff, once a symbol of luxury and national pride, was repurposed as a refugee ship.
The Nazis turned the ship into a vessel to carry civilians away from the Soviet onslaught, and it was fitted with additional accommodations to handle a much larger number of passengers than it was originally designed to carry.
In the winter of 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff was tasked with evacuating refugees from the Baltic port of Gdynia, Poland to Germany.
On January 30, 1945, the ship departed with an estimated 10,000 people aboard. The passengers included German civilians, soldiers, members of the Nazi Party, women, children, and elderly people. The numbers of people on board, far exceeding the ship's capacity, created dangerous conditions, with inadequate life-saving equipment, overcrowded spaces, and a lack of proper provisions. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not the only ship attempting to evacuate refugees, but it was one of the largest and most visible. The evacuation fleet had to make its way through the treacherous waters of the Baltic Sea, which were under constant threat from Soviet forces. On the night of January 30, 1945, as the Wilhelm Gustloff made its way out of Gotenhafen, it became a target for Soviet submarines.
The Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, was on patrol in the Baltic Sea.
It had been tracking the German evacuation fleet, and on that night, it came across the Wilhelm Gustloff. In the early hours of January 30, at approximately 9:15 p.m., the S-13 fired 3 torpedoes at the Wilhelm Gustloff. The torpedoes struck the starboard side of the ship, causing massive damage. The first torpedo struck the ship's engine room, causing the power to fail and leaving the ship stranded in the freezing waters. The second and third torpedoes hit the ship's living quarters, sealing its fate. Within minutes of the attack, the Wilhelm Gustloff was listing heavily to one side, and water began flooding its lower decks. Chaos erupted among the passengers, many of whom were unable to escape due to the overcrowded conditions. The ship, once a symbol of Nazi pride, was sinking quickly. It took just 70 minutes for the Wilhelm Gustloff to go down, with many passengers trapped inside or thrown into the icy waters of the Baltic Sea. In total, more than 9,000 people lost their lives in the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The official death toll remains uncertain due to the chaos of the evacuation, but estimates suggest that around 9,400 people perished, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in history. The vast majority of those who died were civilians, many of whom were women and children. The ship's inadequate lifeboats, the freezing water, and the overwhelming number of passengers contributed to the staggering loss of life. The survivors of the disaster were few, and many had to endure the brutal cold of the Baltic Sea as they awaited rescue. Some managed to cling to debris or escape to nearby ships, but others were not so fortunate. The Soviet submarines' attack also sealed the fate of any possible rescue, as it was an act of war, and no ships came to the Wilhelm Gustloff's aid. Despite the immense scale of the tragedy, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff did not attract the same international attention as other maritime disasters, such as the sinking of the Titanic. The war was still ongoing, and the Nazis were responsible for many atrocities, which led to a certain reluctance in discussing the event in the post-war years. Additionally, the Soviet Union's role in the attack and the nature of the disaster being tied to a fleeing Nazi regime led to complex political and historical factors that obscured its importance in the larger narrative of the war. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was a horrifying chapter in the history of World War II and maritime disasters. It has been largely forgotten in mainstream discussions of war-related tragedies, and many of the lives lost that day remain nameless. The disaster serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war, both on the battlefield and in the civilian lives caught in the crossfire. In recent years, there has been a growing effort to recognize the tragedy and honor the memory of those who perished on the Wilhelm Gustloff. Books, documentaries, and memorials have been created to educate the public about the disaster and its significance in the history of World War II. The event stands as a symbol of the devastation caused by the war and the untold suffering of the millions who were displaced, including those who lost their lives aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff.
In many ways, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff is a forgotten tragedy of World War II.
But it remains one of the most deadly and tragic maritime disasters in history, a reminder of the human suffering that occurred during the final days of the war.